Hey everyone, Taylor Hokinson here, and I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of Premiere. In this video, you're going to learn everything you need to know about the software from importing through editing and effects and exporting, and we will cover the specific needs of our particular project in Foundation Studio. Okay, so what you can see right here is a list of aspect ratios, and one thing to know about recording video, I assume most people will be doing this on their phones, is that phones tend to want to record still images in 4:3, right? So the ratio here is 4:3 units, whereas to show something on a nice wide monitor tends to be more like 16:9. So we're all going to be aiming here for a resolution or an aspect ratio known as 16:9 or 1080p, and by default most of your phones should be capturing this already, but just in case you want to change that, I can show you how I Googled this for my phone. I have an iPhone, and I went into the settings, looked for settings related to the photos and the camera, and when it comes to the resolution we're recording at, I was trying to pick 1080p, and it doesn't really matter 30 or 60 FPS, but you might want to go with 30. It'll just save you some space. So by default, some people may be recording at a higher rate. Some people might have fairly old phones that are a little bit slower, and then also, if you have access to other video equipment, by all means use it. But ultimately, what we're hoping to do is to get our files at 1080p, aka 16:9. Although there are some different resolutions that are also 16:9. So focus on 1080p, and you'll just have to do some research for your particular device. So that's if you're recording video off of your phone or a personal device, but also note that you can accumulate video footage from other sources too. So if you want to work with found footage, one site that I really recommend is the Internet Archive. It's archive.org, and they go through and they kind of scrape the internet for material over a long period of years. You can even go back and kind of rewind websites with the Wayback Machine on this site. But you can see here I've just gone into the audio section. I dug down and I found some jazz music or something like that. Now if you scroll down a little bit, when you click through, some of these will be downloadable and some won't. So you can see here this one lets us download. And I've specifically opened up the MP3 files, but you might see a list that looks more like this. So you want to take a look through, and if there's stuff that you don't recognize, like FLAC or torrenting, we can avoid and all that stuff. I just want to download something nice and simple like an MP3, and then I went through here and I right-clicked and said Save Link As, and I saved that out to my desktop. Okay, so however you get there, you're going to want to also be very careful about organization. So you can see I've laid this stuff out on my desktop to make it clearer so that I can describe this to you guys. I'm going to start up a new folder, and while it's possible to use this program in a slightly different way, I really recommend you just do it exactly as I'm doing it, because then you're less likely to run into problems. So let's call this the FA, or Fall 23 Resistance Project. Okay, so I'll have a blank folder right there, and then I'll open that up, and I'll start to load in different items. I'll also make a subfolder, and we'll call this Source. And you'll note that I'm doing this in all lowercase. So one of the tricky things about Premiere is that when you're building a video, all of the content of that video does not live within a single monolithic Premiere file, right? So soon we'll be making a Premiere file, but that's actually just sort of a list of the types of edits that we want to make onto a distributed set of media. So we need to make sure that the Premiere file always knows where to find its source media, and that's why we're setting up this organizational structure. So I've got test.mov. I'm going to pull that in there. I've got demon.mov, which are two little clips I made. And then I'll also put my audio in here, although I might rename this just to Crazy, so it's not harder to find later. And I'll also put that into source. So again, we have Fine Arts, or rather, I'm sorry, Fall, FA23 Resistance Project is the top level folder. And then inside that folder is this source folder. So let's go ahead and open up Premiere, like so. So again, Premiere is something that all Columbia College students will have free access to. All you need to do is download it to your machine, and you're off. We can also talk about access on campus for those that don't have powerful machines. So the first thing we'll see is an opportunity here to open up old files. I'm just going to go through to New Project. The first option I have is to name the project, so I might just call this again resistance or something like that. I have to establish the project location, so let's choose that location, and we'll make this folder on the desktop that I've created. Okay, for template we have none. Over here we want to create a new sequence, great, and we can leave that as the default. If you want, you can also turn on automatic transcription, so say if you're doing interviews and things like that, that might be useful for you. And then I'll say create. So what we see before us is about 5 windows, 4 of which are always going to be there and 1 of which is kind of optional. At the upper left you can see we have source. Over here we have program. Down here is project. Over here is timeline. And then this one will change depending on what kind of windows we have up. So we're not going to bother with this Lumetri color. You may or may not see that, but those windows are going to pop up based on what you select over here. Okay, so we're just going to leave that alone for now. I'm calling them windows, but I think they're also referred to as panes because the overall area we're working with is the Premiere window. Okay, so let's go ahead and import some material. I'll come down here to the lower left in the Project tab, or pane rather, and you'll see I can use my mouse wheel to bring up a bunch of different tabs that relate to the project pane. You may also be able to click on this little fellow and find what you're looking for. So we just want the first one that lists the name of our project, and here it says import media to start, so I'll double click on that. It'll take me to the last place I was working on the computer, but now I want to go to desktop, resistance project, source, and then I can bring in these each of these individual items. Let's see if it can do more than one at a time. It looks like it can also import a folder, but note that if I change that folder by adding more material, I'll have to import it again later anyway. So I'll just import these 3 items all together. Great. So we can see our MP3 and our MOVs have shown up. If you try to import something and it kind of resists, you may have to change the format before Premiere will listen to it. Okay, so the first thing I'll do is to take one of these movies. Let's just take Demon, for example, and I'll drag it across onto the timeline pane. It asks if I want to do auto transcription because it notices some voice and so forth. I'm going to say no for now, but that's certainly something that you can try. You can also see here that I've automatically popped into the text tab. So I'm going to move this back over to source. Okay, so now in the timeline, what I have is a sort of visual representation of my clip. So it's going to be video on top. See how this is a V track? And then audio below. This is an A track. And you can have lots and lots of video and audio tracks all layered on top of each other. By default, if I click on one, they're both going to get highlighted, so they're linked, and that makes sure that the voice or the sound that I has is linked up in time to the corresponding movements in the video. As I'm sure you've also noticed, when we imported this stuff over here onto the timeline, it also popped up in the program window, and I'm going to change these sizes so that's a little bigger. So the way to think about program is this is what the ultimate result of all your work on the timeline is going to be at output, right? So as I drag this little playhead around, I'll be able to see my video. This is a video of me demonstrating my Halloween costume that I made. And if you don't want to hear that audio every time you scrabble through, you can also come down in here and mute it by clicking on M. Now, the other thing we want to check on is that we have the right aspect ratio. So when I moved that clip over here onto the timeline will automatically adopt the size of the clip. So if I go up to Edit, or rather Sequence and Sequence Settings, I'll be able to see here that my frame size is 1920 by 1080, and then it reminds me that that ratio is 16 by 9, and that is actually what we want to see. Now if I had done this a little bit differently, I also happen to have here an example of a test movie that's 4:3. So if I drag this over, it's going to say the clip does not match the sequence's settings, and should I change them to match? And I'm going to say keep existing settings. And so now what I'll see when I move the playhead over, this is actually just a random piece of video I accidentally kind of butt dialed or captured on my phone when I was in the car. So this piece of video is cropped a little bit, right? So it wants to be a little bit taller in ratio, but because I'm putting it onto a sequence that's slightly different, it's just going to change a little bit in size. So we'll lose a little bit of information on the top and the bottom. It's also possible when you do this that your image will show up, or your video will show up with black bars on the sides or on the top and the bottom. which isn't, ideal, but ultimately as long as we all export at 1080p, it'll make it a lot easier to put all these videos together into a big film festival. Okay, so we've got our first little clip on the line. You can see that this one is relatively short, so I can use this bar down here to affect essentially how far zoomed in we are. So sometimes that makes it a little easier. Sometimes I also like to drag around the height of these bars so I can get a better look at the audio track. So the essential stuff you can do with editing, and often it's all that's needed because you don't need to make flashy stuff. First of all, we can come over here to this little toolbar, and I can select the razor tool. I also want to verify that these three little icons are blue or selected. So the two that we care about here, we see there's a linked selection. So linking keeps the video and audio paired together. And then over here is the snap in timeline tool represented by a magnet. So we want that activated as well. So one thing I can do is to come in here and make a cut. The reason this is a razor blade is because it's alluding to a time right when you would be working with actual film. And then we come back up to the selection tool, and I can just take the first part of my video and drag it until it snaps behind the other one. If I drag the mouse like a box, I can select more than one clip at once and just pull them back to the beginning. And there I've made my first successful edit. So right now we have a sort of kind of a harsh cut from one part of the video to the other part of the video. Also, don't forget, right, if you click mute and you this will not prevent the audio from being exported later, so make sure if you do this, you check in to see what your audio is sounding like. So now we've got something like that in our funky little video. Okay, now there's also a bunch of options that we've got if we right-click. So for example, if I right-click here, you can see there's a huge panel. One of the simple things I can look at is just to unlink. So say, for example, I want to keep this video, but I want to separate it from the audio. Now I can select these things individually. I think you can do this by toggling this button too, but that's usually not how I do it. So maybe I just want to get rid of some of that audio entirely or move it around. And I'll hit undo so I can keep these linked. We might be able to tell a little bit more easily what's happening if I bring the demon over here. You'll also notice that as you put stuff on the timeline, you'll get a little reference here to the sequence in addition to the original movie, just so you know why those things are popping up. Okay, so here I've got my longer video, so maybe I'll come in. If I want, I can just drag from the side to make these things shorter as well. That's like the equivalent of using the razor to cut a piece off, but I can always drag that out back again if I want that material back. This is the beauty of non-destructive video editing. So let's get in here and maybe we'll take this, we'll right-click it. We can say speed and duration. Let's make this thing 25% the speed and say OK. There you go. So now you can hear, that audio getting like brrr. We can kind of come over here and listen to some of the voice as well. So that's an example of one of the sort of simple effects you can grab. I'm going to hit undo on that one. Two other things that you might be interested in that are from that menu, and of course feel free to explore, but I could find a frame that I think is particularly interesting. Right click, and then somewhere in here we have insert a frame hold, right? So I could do like insert frame hold segment, and that'll just give me a couple of seconds where I'm doing nothing but just showing the still. Of course that'll have no audio, so we need to deal with that. And then finally we also have just a basic one, which is audio gain, which is, like a fancy term for the volume. So for example, I could normalize the max peak to say -12, and that's going to go ahead and just bring everything to a nice spot.
Okay.
And you'll see over here, we're filling up the audio bar without redlining it. So this was the part that I normalized, and this was the part that I didn't. Okay, gang, next up we're going to just take a little look at effect controls, and I've been noodling around here a lot in the timeline, so let me just delete this material. I'll bring the daemon back over, and then this time I'm also going to layer something on the top, so I'll take test.mov and put it here on top. So now we're starting to make use of this multi-track kind of thing. So you'll see that in this section, right, I can see only the video on the top because it is large enough to control that entire space. But once that's gone, we see down through, almost like a deck of cards or a stack of transparencies or something like that. For this section, I'm also going to come in here and unlink all this audio so we don't have to listen to it. And I'll just get rid of it so that right now we're just playing around with the video. While I'm at it, if I wanted to, I could even come in here and clip this other piece so we just have a nice tight little set of images to look at. Okay, so again, we can only see the one on top because it is not transparent. It's completely opaque. So if I take either of these videos, let's start out with the one on top and double click it, you'll see that it pops up over here in the source pane. And this can be confusing, right? Because now I can see the same image twice. So what's the difference between the two? Well, now what we're doing on the right hasn't changed, right? Because that's still the overall output of the entire video. But on the left, we're going to go in there and start to edit this clip, and specifically the particular instance of this clip on the timeline. So instead of just looking at this first tab, I'll click over to Effect Controls. Now under Effect Controls, you'll see some really essential stuff that you may want to change about a video frame. For example, its position, its scale, its rotation, and so forth. So what I can do is click on these and type in the numbers, or I can just drag them. So for example, I can drag the scale of this clip down, right, so it doesn't occupy the full frame. You can see the ratio is different, right, because this is a 4:3 clip. I could also get here and mess around with its position, so if I wanted to, I could do kind of like a frame-in-frame thing, like that. If I wanted to, I could also rotate it around, so I could put it at a funky angle. I could type in a specific angle or whatever. And you get the idea. I could also mess around with opacity if I wanted to keep it full frame but be able to kind of see through to the background. So let's just see what happens if we play this now. If I come back to the beginning, looks like these slid off of the front. Now I can play it, and you can see that these are both happening at the same time. And of course it's silent because we deleted the audio. So this kind of stuff starts to be more kind of special case. Like say, for example, you were trying to mimic how a newscast might look, right? You'd be sitting at a desk, and then you could have a little sort of frame-in-frame showing things as you go. And I just want to make you aware of an additional feature that you don't have to use, but where I think things get really exciting, is that if I double-click here again on test.mov and go to Effect Controls, I can also add in what's known as keyframes, right? So at the moment, nothing is keyframed. Don't worry, I'll define this in a minute. So if I change something like the position or scale, scale is going to be set to 37% throughout this entire piece. But if I go down to the timeline and I come back up to the beginning, I just press the up arrow. Now I can go to scale and set it, let's say, back to 100. And the position, I forget exactly where the position was supposed to be, so I might need to hit undo right there. There we go. And in this case, I can click on this little stopwatch next to the scale. So what that does, maybe you didn't see it, but it added in this little diamond at frame 0. And then back on the timeline, I can go all the way to the end. And this time, instead of clicking on the watch, I click on this diamond right here. So what we've essentially done is set a sort of map of a value at frame number 1 and frame number 0. So the value is 100 at frame 1. But now that I'm sitting at frame, the last frame in the sequence, now I can put that value down to 0. And so what the computer is going to do is interpolate the change from this value to this value automatically. And as we go back, we'll see it go like that. Right, so I go back to the front. I have a keyframe that says, yes, I represent 100%, and a keyframe at the end that says, I represent 0, and it figures out the distance in between. And now if we go back and play, we can see this thing happen kind of by itself over time. It's pretty cool once you dig into it, right? Because you can have multiple different types of variables changing in multiple different ways. So let's say that I go to rotation. Right now I'm at the beginning of my clip. I activate keyframing, gives me a keyframe. I come down here and I press the down arrow on my keyboard to get to the end. And I add another keyframe like so, but this time I change the value and I say 360. Right? And so it makes one big rotation. So now I come back and I play it, and I can get some funky effects that look like that. So pretty cool for not a lot of effort, right? And if you really dig in here, you can also add keyframes throughout. So say, for example, I wanted a keyframe right here. I wanted a keyframe right here. You know, they're kind of getting stacked up. And if I want to navigate between them, I use these little arrows, and then at each point I can change the value. And I'm just doing this kind of at random here. Let's say with the next one we go back in a negative direction. Oh, maybe it's not going to let us do that. Okay, it sure did. So now if I go back to the beginning, I'm going to get some like really funky motion where I'm turning in one direction, turning the other direction, and so forth. So making edits up here to the default position, scale, rotation, and so forth is just the tip of the iceberg, and I'll show you where to look for some other fancy stuff, although it's not required. So if we want to experiment with effects and also transitions, which fall outside of the defaults, we're going to come down here to this pane, and we'll bring up effects. And once you list your effects, you'll see there's audio effects and video effects, and then also audio transitions and video transitions. They all work the same way. You drag them over here onto the scene, although the effects are a little simpler. If you know what you're looking for, you can search them in the bar right here. And some of these, honestly are kind of cheesy, but it's fun to get in here and mess around. So for example, if I look under Distort, I might come up with something interesting like, let's do a wave warp, which I don't even know what this is. But I'll take it and I'll drag it onto the top here, and you'll see that now I have a whole nother set of alterations that I can make. And you see how it's given that image right there a kind of wobbly texture, including the outer edge. I can change around the wave height, so you can see it moving around over there. I can mess around with the wave width and so on. So these effects, maybe they're sort of special cases, but you should get around them there and play with them anyway, and know that to change the nature of the effect, the strength and the variables and so forth, it'll pop up in the exact same place as position and scale and so forth over here. Now transitions get a little bit trickier, and one of the things with transitions is that sometimes they need a little bit of overlapping footage. So if I take this piece of footage and I just cut it, that means that there's no extra frames on either side of this thing. It just lands right where it is, and this is going to cause the program to complain. So if I want to do some kind of transition, instead of just making a cut right there, let me bring back in another copy of daemon.mov, and we'll stick it right here, and we'll also unlink it and get rid of its audio. So in order for this transition to work, I'll just get rid of daemon down here as well so we can see what we're doing. We're going to make sure that there's footage on either side. So am I able to stretch this out? No, because that's the absolute end of the clip. So what I might need to do is make this artificially a little bit shorter, and then I bring in my daemon and I overlap that too, but then make the beginning a little bit shorter. So the nice thing about this is when I drag these edges, right, that material is still available, right? The computer hasn't destroyed it. So now when I put these two together, they'll be ready to be transitioned. Okay, so we go back to effects right here. I want to collapse this stuff, and then I will bring up so many options. I'm going to bring up video transitions, and some of the ones that I like to use the best are the dissolves because they're more subtle. But if we, let's just start with one of those. So maybe we'll do like a cross dissolve. So I drag this over, and I want to put it so it's overlapping those two spots. It doesn't complain because we gave it some extra video to mess with. And now when I play it, it has a much nicer and smoother transition. You can do the same thing on the back end of your video. If you just say dip to black, it'll just go all the way and black out like kind of a professional video might end. So I'll suck this thing back in. Okay, the last thing I want to show you before we get to exporting is how to add titles. So in order to do that, I'll pick the text tool. I'll click here on the frame and then start writing my name. Usually it's hard to get this centered by hand, so I'll show you a little trick for fixing that up. We'll go to Window and then down to Essential Graphics. You would think you would go to Text, but in this case we need Essential Graphics. And that's going to pop up over here on the right-hand side. So under Align and Transform, I can align vertically and I can align horizontally, and we get that guy nice and centered. Now if I zoom in, you'll see what's actually happened all the way in is we've just added a single frame of text. So we can take that and we can drag it way out so that it occupies more time. I would probably try to have text on the screen, for at least a couple seconds so that people actually have time to read it, but no more than 5. I'll put mine on here for 4. 4 or so. And you'll see that by default also, I'll switch back to the arrow here, that text just lays on top of whatever the screen happens to be doing. So if you would prefer for your text to just be on a black background, you can pull everything forward like this, and then your text has nothing to compete with. However, sometimes it is kind of nice to have text over the image. That's more of just an aesthetic choice for you to make. Great, so we've covered a lot of ground here. I think we have all the basic editing completely locked down, and then lots and lots of options if you want to get experimental. So our last step is to get to export. If you haven't been already, definitely be saving throughout, right? Because I think export is the time when things are most likely to crash, but also, if you're doing like a lot of heavy effects and that kind of thing. So now we'll switch over to export, give it a second to load up. We're going to name this file, and you can see that right now it wants to output as an MP4, so that's fine. And I'll just call this, I think I have this laid out in the instructions, but I'm going to call it Hokanson Taylor _ Filmfest _ FA 2023. If we all do it in that way, this should be really easy to track. I can see it's going to land on the desktop. And then in terms of the presets, I'm going to come down here to high quality 1080p. We'll leave the format as H.264. All this stuff gets left as is. And then I'll go ahead and say export. Now it's a very short film. I think it's only 10 seconds long, so that's going to go awful quick. We're going to hide everything. We're going to find the video, open it up, and just verify that it's playing. There's our text, there's our spinning image, and then we should see a transition to the rest of this material. So that's it, Premiere in a nutshell. I encourage you to go back and watch this video more than once. I'm also going to be posting written notes to our class. And with all these resources together, we should be able to get you up to speed on Premiere, even if you've never used it before. Trust me, it's not as intimidating as it looks. And in fact, it's really exciting once you realize how much you can do with a couple of basic techniques.